I have read 13 books so far this year, and we are going to talk about them. Okay, so I've read 13 books this year, but only 6 of them have been physical copies, and the other 7 are on my Kindle. And the first book this year that I read was actually on my Kindle. It was The Reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson. I am obsessed with all of her books. I actually have the Good Girls Guide to Murder series and 5 Survive on my shelf right behind me. And this book is about the daughter of Rachel Price, who is filming a documentary about her mom's disappearance, and then all of a sudden her mom reappears. I like how the title actually gives it away, and there is a line in the book that kind of hints at that, or like is a little nod to the title. Holly Jackson is also really good at writing like funny stuff, so like while there's obviously the seriousness of these disappearances and like the mystery blah blah blah, the characters are hilarious and it's really easy to like the characters. And I've noticed that in like Holly Jackson's books, like I always love the characters, I always hate the characters who I'm supposed to hate, I always love the characters who I'm supposed to love, and she does a really good job of like making you feel a certain way towards the characters that are intentional. It's so hard to talk about it without spoilers, but I gave it 5 stars. My first book of the year was 5 stars, and that was a good sign, and honestly, a pretty good representation of how everything else has gone. Okay, as probably 80% of readers did this year, I reread Fourth Wing because this beautiful book came out this year. So I did read Fourth Wing first. I read this for the first time in like November of 2023, and I wanted to hate this book so bad. I wanted to hate it. I thought I was gonna hate it. Went into it with the idea like, oh, I'm reading this so I can hate on it. I was wrong. I pre-ordered Onyx Storm like last March when it was first announced. I went into it seeing the stuff that people on like booktok were saying, that like, oh my god, this is so bad, like I hate this is like garbage, like who can read this? Me, bitch. I can read it, I read it, I loved it, and now it's like my whole personality. And before I read this, I had like only been like a romance and like thriller mystery reader. Now all I read is fantasy. I know this is kind of like romantasy, so it's not very like hardcore fantasy. It's her first fantasy book. It's not perfect, but for it being her first fantasy book and she's a romance writer, I think it was pretty good. It was easy to follow along. There wasn't anything like I wasn't sitting here like confused. Same thing with this book. I was attached to the characters. I am a Riddick, however the hell you say it, stan for life. I haven't even talked about what the book is about because I don't shut the fuck up. Fourth Wing is about dragon riders at a dragon college. They almost like volunteer to be part of the riders quadrant. Violet, who has been a scribe her whole life, was forced into the riders quadrant to bond with a dragon and become a dragon rider by her mother, who is like the head of the school. And it's so good. It's so good, and I could talk about the entire book right now, but I'm not supposed to spoil anything. But spoiler alert, Liam! No! I just realized I was holding up Iron Flame that whole time. This is Fourth Wing, my beautiful deluxe version. I do have the paperback and the original version because I have no self-control. I also read this for the first time back in 2023, but I wanted to reread it before Onyx Storm came out. When I first read this book, for some reason I was like, oh, like it was okay, like I didn't hate it, but it wasn't my favorite. Rereading this, oh my god, it is so good. I also obviously have the deluxe special version and the regular. It's really hard to talk about this one without spoiling Fourth Wing. I can say that this is a lot more about kind of like war. Like the premise of Fourth Wing is like preparing for war, and that's what this kind of goes into, but it's like not how you would expect in Fourth Wing. Like if I told you the plot of this book and you were in like chapter 20 of Fourth Wing, you'd be like, what the hell? I gave it 5 stars. This whole series has been 5 stars to me so far. I think at first I gave it like 4, and I'm also very generous with my 5-star rating, so take that with a grain of salt. Last but not least, in the Reappearance series, this sexy motherfucker, Onyx Storm. This book was like one of the most anticipated books for me. When I first got it on January 21st or whatever, I read like the first chapter or two, and I like could not understand it. I was like, what is happening? I'm so confused. Have I even read the rest of the series? Like what? Like I don't understand. Like I'm lost. And then I put it down. I read something else in between. I picked it back up and then I read it. It made perfect sense. So I think I was just being stupid. Holy shit. I loved this book. The ending, what the actual fuck. This book was very like lively. I think it was because they were exploring like outside the regular like Bazgayev, Navarre continent, whatever. And they were going to like other little islands, and like it was so cute, and they all had like their own kind of like personality. This series is like actively being worked on for a TV show at Amazon. You can tell that this book was definitely kind of written with that in mind. Everything that was written in this can pretty much be translated to a TV show or a movie, if that makes any sense. I don't know, probably doesn't. If you haven't read this series, you really should. I think that people who say they don't like it, like either A, want to be different, or B, they think that everything needs to be some like literary genius, Shakespearean, like I don't know. But I was entertained. Is it like the best writing I've ever read? No. Is this like gonna go down in the history books as like state-of-the-art literature? No. But I was entertained, I had fun, and that's completely okay. So in between reading Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, I needed a little short book just to like keep my brain from turning into mush, because if I read like too much fantasy back to back to back, it turns into words on paper, and we don't want that. So I read this super tiny, like 170 page book. And that is The Widow's Husband's Secret Lie by Frida McFadden. She is a extremely good like mystery thriller writer. Her books always have like insane plot twists, and they're just like really fun to read. They're really simple, they're really digestible. Like you don't have to use a lot of brain power. This is a novella, but it's just a satirical novella because it's kind of like a joke. All of the things that happen in this book, or most of the things that happen in this book, are like cliches, and she does it like super extra, so it's kind of meant to be like exaggerated and kind of silly, super like unserious. Like the characters are like they're taking it all very seriously, but as the reader you're kind of just like, that's ridiculous. Like the entire conflict in this book is black and blue white gold dress situation from like 2015, and that's what like the characters are arguing about, and some characters like over. So it's really funny. I gave this 3.5 stars because it did what it needed to do. It wasn't the greatest. It was kind of silly, but it got the job done, and I liked it. So I gave this 3.5 stars. Okay, so the next book that I read was on my Kindle, and that was Escape Room by Maren Stoffels. This is a YA thriller mystery. So this book was about a group of kids, teenagers. One of them sees a flyer for an escape room, and so they all want to do it, and the game master, the host, is like doing weird things, and that's hurting them, blah blah blah. It's very YA. It was almost too juvenile for me, but I saw it through because I was still entertained, but it was just like, okay, this is kind of silly. If I was like 6 years younger, I probably would have absolutely adored this. It was a 3-star for me. And the next book that I read was also only on my Kindle, and that is another Frida McFadden book, Never Lie. This one was about a psychologist who deals with patients, and some of them are a little bit, you know, not what they seem. Some of the book is told through transcripts of her meetings that she would record. She does a very good job of like tricking the reader, so like we think it's gonna go one way, but then it actually goes another. But I have to admit, this is one of her weaker books, in my opinion. I know people love this book, they hype it up, they're like, oh my god, like this was insane, like the plot twist was crazy. For me, it was just a little bit too ridiculous. I was entertained. I did enjoy the book. I gave it 3 stars. I just feel like compared to some of her other books that I've read, this is one of the weaker ones. Alright, so the next book that I read was once again on my Kindle. This one was called Something in the Walls by Daisy Pierce. This was my first like horror book that I actually got through. This one was about another child psychologist who gets called into this town to tend to a girl who people are like accusing of being a witch. I love this book. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. But once again, this book did a really good job of making me like characters that the author wanted me to like, and to dislike or distrust characters that the author wanted me to distrust. I tried to make a few predictions at the beginning when they were giving like little hints as what was happening, and I was wrong, which never happens. Just kidding. I know in the beginning, like a little excerpt, it said it was like for fans of The Conjuring and things like that, which I enjoy. Guess what, guys? We have another Kindle book. This one is insane to me because this is another arc, and this one hasn't been released yet. But do you remember the first book that I read this year? The Reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson. I think at this point it's safe to say that Holly Jackson is one of my favorite writers. I have read all of her books, and she has a new book, her first adult thriller, coming out called Not Quite Dead Yet, and I got to read it early. It gets published in June, and I read it a couple weeks ago, and this book had me in a chokehold, and I swear I'm not just being biased because it's Holly Jackson. This book was so good. It was so funny. The main character, Jet, I loved her. Like, I want to be her. Obviously, I don't want to, well, I'm not going to spoil it, but the whole premise of this book is that someone tries to kill Jet after a Halloween party, and they don't kill her, but she finds out that she only has so much time to live after that because they did something to like her spine, or she's inevitably going to have an aneurysm. There were so many characters that I loved, and there were so many characters that I absolutely hated, and it's another one of those books where, like I said in the Reappearance of Rachel Price, she does such a good job of making me feel such strong emotions towards different characters, and it's intentional. Billy. That's all I have to say. I gave it 5 stars. I knew I was going to give it 5 stars like halfway through because I was like, this book is so good, and the ending was absolutely insane. It wasn't like, you know, oh my god, like I'm so shocked, like blah blah blah. It wasn't what I expected, but it's what I needed. You know what? It's what I needed. This was such a quick read. I think I read it in like 3 days, and that's pretty fast for me. I highly recommend when it comes out. I think the publishing date is June 15th. I'll correct myself if I'm wrong, but this was so good. I need it injected into my veins. We have a physical book. Yippee. Okay, so the next book is another reread. I read Assassin's Blade by Sarah J. Maas. This is the prequel to Throne of Glass. I read like 5 out of the 8 Throne of Glass books last year, but then for some reason I stopped. I want to finish the series, but I figured since it's been quite a while, I will just reread them. And I did read Assassin's Blade 3rd when I first read it, because if you know anything about the series, there's kind of like a weird reading order, and you can either read this book first, 3rd, or some people read it 4th. I don't know why you would do that. But then with the 6th and 7th books, you can also read them at the same time. There's like a whole guide where you can read like chapter by chapter. It's actually really cool. It's called a tandem read. So I finished this one. Last year I gave it 5 stars. This year I gave it 5 stars. I highly recommend reading this 3rd. The only reason I could see someone reading this first is if they get confused with like timeline and they would rather just have everything be chronological. But if you want this book to like hit the heart the most and you want like the more emotional read it 3rd. This series is my favorite series of all time. I think Sarah J. Maas is one of, if not my absolute favorite author. So I will recommend Throne of Glass until the day that I die. I've been begging Taylor to read it. Taylor, if you see this, like, you need to read this. And this book is the prequel to Throne of Glass, and Throne of Glass is about an assassin who is brought to the kingdom to compete to be the king's champion and essentially be his like go-to assassin. There's 5 short stories in here, and obviously the first one is like the oldest, and the last short story is like right before the events of Throne of Glass. Oh my god, this book killed me. That's all I have to say about this. This book killed me. So the next book that I read was actually the $5 book at Barnes & Noble when you buy like a cafe item, and that is If Cats Disappeared from the World. I liked it. I had a hard time getting into it at first because some of like the topics aren't really my cup of tea. I'm glad I actually did push through it because the message at the end and the overall message of the book is actually really sweet. So this is about a man who has terminal cancer, and he is approached by the devil, and the devil is like, I will make a deal with you where for an extra day of life you can get rid of something in the world. The devil, his name is Aloha, and he comes in like Hawaiian shirts, and it's kind of like silly, but it kind of talks about like how we take the little things for granted, because the first thing that he gets rid of is clocks. To us, like, clocks are just there, like we don't really think about them, we don't appreciate them. He realizes how much he actually does rely on clocks. The message is kind of just like to like appreciate the things around you, like don't take things for granted. It was a really sweet read. I definitely recommend it. I think I gave it a 3 star, probably more like a 3.5. Okay, so my last 2 books were Kindle books. The first one is another art. It is called The Thrashers by Julie Soto. This book was about a group of kids who experienced the loss of a friend. It's a thriller book, but it's also kind of like horror because there's kind of like ghostly elements. Like a lot of stuff happens to this friend group, and you kind of figure out like what the connection is to the girl who died, if they were actually really friends. It was a little bit juvenile for me, but I enjoyed it. It's another one of those, like, if I read this 6 years ago, I would have loved it. I did give it a 4-star because me being above the age range isn't the author's fault, that's my fault. When I read this, I forgot what it was about, so I wasn't expecting the ghost, like, paranormal element, but I did like it. The ending was pretty cool. I did like the ending, like the epilogue. There were some scenes where I was just like, wow, like there was a scene where, spoiler alert, the car drives off a bridge and they're underwater, and one of the girls gets stuck because she's like a panic attack, and she's like, what if this was like meant to happen, like because her mom had died by drowning, and she was like, what if this was meant to happen, like what if I was meant to drown, and then she gets saved. But the whole time I was reading this scene underwater, like I was physically holding my breath for some reason. But yeah, I think if you need something fast-paced, something quick, something easy, something entertaining, it's definitely worth the read. So the very last book that I've read so far this year is Maid for Each Other by Lynn Painter. This is the only like pure romance book that I've read this year because lately I haven't been a big romance reader. But oh my god, this book was so cute. I read through it so fast, but I've heard amazing things about Lynn Painter. This is another arc. I haven't read any of her other books, but I've heard such good things about her, and I can see why. Like, it was super fun, it was super cute. It's basically about a maid is cleaning this super rich guy's house, and her house is like infested with something, and so she decides, since this guy whose house she's cleaning is out of town, she's like, oh, I'm just gonna, you know, spend the night at his house. He's not even gonna know. I have the key, I know everything is, blah blah blah. His parents show up the next morning and they're like, hey Abby, and the maid's name is Abby, so she's super confused as to why they like know who she is. But then it turns out that Declan, the rich guy whose house she's staying in, has a fake girlfriend that he's been telling his parents about because they are like on his ass about, you know, why don't you have a girlfriend, why don't you blah blah blah, and he made one up to just get them to shut up. So then she essentially pretends to be his girlfriend for like some events and stuff like that, and it's only supposed to be like a one weekend thing, but then it turns into more, and yeah, you can kind of, I'm sure you can predict where that goes. I did give it a 4-star. So anyway, Pookies, those are the 13 books that I've read so far in 2025. I'm on pace to hit my goal of 70 books. Sorry for how gross I sound, I'm like sick. I'm gonna link all the books that I read in the description because I think you should read them. So yeah, thank you for watching, and please read the books that I just talked about because I need to yap about them. Thanks, bye!